Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Ecologic Institute ELEAP lunch webinar or luncheon webinar with our special guest today, Leah Germer, presenting today which little piggies go to market, environmental policy incentives in Costa Rican pig production. So I would like to welcome you all to this event today. I'm very glad to have this as the very first ELEAP event of this session of this year. ELEAP is the Emerging Leaders for Environmental and Energy Policy Network. It's a project that's been ongoing since 2011. We have many fellows and alumni on both sides of the Atlantic. That's why we have a webinar included in it for those who cannot be here in the Ecologic office in Washington. Two segments to the event today. One is your presentation, and afterwards we'll be able to talk a little bit. We will be also able to get questions in via Twitter. We have actually Andrew here live tweeting today from the event under the ELEAP group account. So there will be the opportunity to send questions to the ELEAP Twitter account throughout the whole session. And we will do our best to answer these questions as well. And of course, we will be also answering and discussing here in real life in the room. So that's the plan. And so we will start now with a little round of introductions here in the room. So we're a small number, so it's possible to say briefly who we are. So my name is Max Grünig. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Ecologic Institute here in Washington. And I would like to hand over to Leah right away to introduce herself. And then we do the circle, and then you can present.
Okay. My name's Leah. It's really nice to meet you all. I am an alum of Ecologic Berlin, who has recently spent time doing research in Latin America and finished a master's program in environmental policy. And today I'll be talking about some key results of my master's thesis. Pass it on to Liz.
I'm Liz Tetson. I'm a senior fellow with the Ecologic Institute. I'm Carolyn Jean. I'm the office manager for the Ecologic Institute.
Hello, I'm Daniel Bennett. I work at the Atlantic Council where I help coordinate the ELEAP program.
I'm Andrew Stoppelbach. I'm an intern with the Ecologic Institute this summer. I'm working on ELEAP, and I'm a graduate student at Indiana University.
Christina Ennis. I'm also an intern with the Ecologic Institute. I'm Eliza Furno. I'm an intern with the American Biogas Council.
I'm Polly. I'm with the Ecologic Institute as an intern as well.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everybody. And now we can go right away into the presentation. If so, for you to go back and forth, I think you can do this right here.
Okay, great.
Thank you. And then the floor is all yours.
Okay, great. Thank you all very much for being here. I just wanted to start out by saying thank you to Ecologic US and the ELEAP presentation. We can have discussion that I'm also excited about because this is an ongoing project. So I'll be excited to take some notes on your feedback. So here's an outline of my presentation. I'm going to start off by talking about why I think we should care about this topic, and then move on to the broader research questions that I was pursuing over the past year and the methodology, and finally to 3 findings and their implications mostly for policy that I see. The scope of my project is a bit larger than what I'll be talking about today, but in the interest of time, I've chosen a few findings that I thought would interest this audience. So I'm going to use the title of the presentation to kind of guide us through the justification for my research project. The title, Which Little Piggies Go to Market? Environmental Policy Incentives incentives. Well, the reason why I'm asking which little piggies go to market is because it tells us which producers are succeeding. And for those of you who might not have grown up in a US American household, this is a refrain from a childhood rhyme about which piggies from some farm actually make it to market. And I kind of to it as several scientists have over the past decade or two who are interested in looking at why some producers make it and some don't as global livestock production changes. So the question that I am asking is, why is it that some producers make it to market with their wares and others don't, and what kind of environmental producers having? Why are we talking about Costa Rica? Well, mostly because that's where I wound up. My master's program took me to Costa Rica for almost a year, where I worked at CATIE, per its Spanish acronym, or the Tropical Agricultural Research Organization in the valley of Costa Rica. There I drove around in this truck for almost 4 months with this Dutch guy, working in partnership with the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, which is an international partnership that aims to reduce short-lived climate pollutants. 2 decades has increased by over 1/3, which is far above the world average. So it's very much a hotspot for livestock growth globally. The type of it's occurring is also concentrated. So that means larger volumes about overall. And that trend has very profound environmental impacts in many respects. So I've listed a few of them here. Most people have heard of the environmental problems associated with land use change and deforestation, but lesser known are the impacts of livestock waste on biodiversity and the nutrient cycle, the conservation of soil organic matter, especially the production of feed, which is very emissions intensive, and transport livestock products over the globe. So are we talking about pig production specifically within livestock? Well, I was going to ask anyone here if they would care to comment on these photos. So the top 2 are photos of pig production in Costa Rica. On the left is a farm of about 25,000 animals, and on the right of only about 50. And then the bottom 2 photos are both dairy farms in Costa Rica. And I was wondering if anyone had an observation about the difference between the pig farms and the dairy farms.
Dairy farms are in much better condition.
Okay, cool, interesting.
The big farms are more like a factory, kind of like an industry.
How do you know?
Because there's big buildings that are huge, probably meant to hold all the pig.
Yeah. So what strikes me about it is that you don't see any pigs, which very much is a characteristic of large-scale industrial livestock farming. And yeah, definitely also that produces problems for the infrastructure that people use. That can look pretty dilapidated, especially in some developing countries. But so, basically the type of production systems that you find with pig production in Latin America tend to be confined, larger scale, concentrated, and that poses particular environmental challenges. For example, the management of manure. Where are they putting all that farm waste that's concentrated in such a small area? Whereas with dairy production in Costa Rica is still very much pasture-based and lends itself to a naturally closed nutrient cycle where manure is deposited in the pastures. So when we're talking about environmental impacts, we all know that over the last few years, there's been heightened awareness of climate change. The Climate March, the climate meetings in New York last year, impacts of any activity really on climate change is sort of becoming the center of the environmental conversation. So here are some estimates for livestock contributions to climate change. 7.1 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year, and then expressed as a percent of total anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. The estimations vary a lot depending on what you include in them, and they're also very controversial. The earlier estimates tend to be lower at around 18% because they are limited to on-farm activities. And the later estimates tend to use a life cycle assessment, which also includes things like emissions associated with feed production, which is very large, as we'll see. This is a breakdown of emissions from livestock production based on different components within the system. So you'll see the blue part of that graph is enteric fermentation, which essentially has to do with the way the animal processes what it's eating. 45% from feed production, that's everything green, which is broken down further into emissions related to the type of feed and the type of production. So really the takeaway from this graph is that feed is the most important thing because it impacts digestion and also is in some cases very emissions intensive. Manure management is about 10%, and the emissions associated with manure management are generally methane, having to do with how the manure is stored and maybe applied as fertilizer in the field. Part of my research is looking at the policy incentives in Latin America for ways to reduce emissions from livestock. I looked at almost 15 Latin American countries, most of their climate change plans, rural development plans, renewable energy plans, and I'm just highlighting two of them here. On the left is Mexico's National Climate Change Strategy, and on the right is the Brazilian Low Emissions Agricultural Plan. And both of them are representative of approaches to reducing emissions from livestock in Latin America, in that they really emphasize one technology in particular, and that is anaerobic digestion using biodigesters. So here is a little introduction to biodigesters. On the left, you can see a small scale installation. Basically, it's a pit in the ground that's covered, and the cover that rises from the manure as it sits. And the methane can then either be flared off as CO2, which has a much lower warming potential than CO2. Flared off as CO2, which has a much lower warming potential than methane. Or it can be used as a household source of energy, which in Latin America is very important if you're, for example, cooking dried beans over the stove the entire day. When we talk about environmental policy incentives, we can make some observations. In a lot of the research, you'll notice that certain metrics are used to measure emissions. It's often emissions per unit of product or emissions per animal. And the systems that have low emissions intensity or low emissions per unit of something are the ones that are favored in the policies. Secondly, you can see in international climate and development institutions also a very large preference for managing industrial wastewater and animal excrement using biodigesters. For example, almost all of the clean development mechanism projects under those subcategories are for reducing methane emissions from pig farms specifically. And again, pig farms specifically because of the particular challenges that pig production poses for manure management being concentrated and intensified. So summarizing so far, livestock sectors in Latin America are changing. They're growing, they're becoming more concentrated and intensified and having profound environmental impacts. And many countries in response to that are introducing environmental policies and programs that incentivize certain practices to reduce emissions. And we're seeing a lot of focus on anaerobic digestion. So a few questions to think about as I move into introducing my research question and methodology. How do we define good environmental outcomes for policies to reduce emissions? Do we only focus on climate reducing emissions intensity, where we're thinking about a specific ratio of inputs to outputs? So for example, energy input to meat production output. Or do we want to have more broad or more holistic approaches that also take things like pollution and the nutrient cycle into account? So I'm going to talk about the research question and methodology. Really what I was trying to find out is, how do policies and initiatives to reduce greenhouse gas emissions affect the trend in Latin America toward concentrated, intensified livestock production? So essentially, how do environmental policy incentives affect the trend we're seeing toward this particular type of production? And what impact does that have on the environment overall? I used a case study methodology. the case study is of the trends in Latin America toward concentrated intensified livestock production. And I chose the Costa Rican pig production sector because of some details I'll present in a moment. And the methods I used were a combination of quantitative analysis of publicly available economic data, policy analysis, and 25 very lengthy interviews I did. In the interviews, I just wanted to point out what I was trying to figure out is from the perspective of the farmer, how they feel that a certain policy or initiative impacted their decision about the practices that are most important when we're talking about climate change, and that's feed composition and manure management. And then what type of environmental impact can we expect from those decisions? So here is a graph that shows some important trends in Costa Rican pig production. Over the last 2 decades or so, production has more than doubled in terms of volume, but according to those 3 ag censuses that are available by about a third. So we're seeing a type of trend that we spoke about earlier, more production overall, fewer producers, fewer farms. And that tells us something about the type of production that's taking place. I'll also mention that there have been 2 policies and initiatives in the last decade or so that have been very important for the Costa Rican pig sector. The first is the General Law of the National Animal Health Service, which I'll call the SENASA law per its Spanish acronym. And that requires all producers to construct one of this potential manure management systems. Biodigester is one of them. It's a scale neutral regulation, meaning that it's just a command and control policy, and it affects all producers equally, regardless of what scale they are or how much money they make. The second is the biogas program of the Costa Rican Electricity Institute, public electricity utility. The public electricity utility has a mandate to invest a certain amount in renewable energy. And one of those is biogas, for example, from livestock farms. So they match investments in biodigesters that are made by the participants and also by international donors. However, in order to be eligible for this program, farmers have to have a minimum number of animals or a minimum volume of excrement. So it's really for larger scale farms. So let's talk about some of the findings of my case study. So first of all, I think the SENASA law incentivizes producers to scale up production. So that means more animals, and to transition to practices that are more emissions. And just to illustrate the way some of these producers are thinking, I put a couple of quotes from my interviews. Coffee production or banana production, which are typical of Costa Rica, as the feed for their livestock animals. They've switched to importing grain and using technologies from the US and Europe to achieve higher numbers of animals. They are very well versed in microeconomics and use terms like marginal benefit and economies of scale all the time. That's really how they're thinking. And they realize that once you achieve larger volumes, you can make more money per unit. They also note that they're forming cooperatives in order to reach these higher intensities and these larger volumes. So they're forming farmers associations and importing grain in bulk and being able to negotiate doing that, which is great from a social perspective, but also might be something we're thinking about from an environmental perspective when you hear them say that the point of the cooperative is to do the exact same thing that the large producers do. It's just that individually they can't afford to. So a lot of people see a subsidy to large emitters, given that the program is only available for producers of a certain scale and above. And lastly, many of the small producers are being outcompeted. They talk about these policies, which are environmental policies, as the main source of their higher competition that they're facing. Anything that increases their costs is a huge challenge for large producers, and anything that decreases the cost of their competitor is a huge challenge. So they're less profitable relative to their fellow producers, And they're realizing that the impetus for some of these policies is achieving environmental goals such as reducing emissions, reducing contamination. I won't go into this now, but free trade is also a part of the story, and it's important enough that I should just mention. Costa Rica has been opening up trade slowly as much of its neighbors have over the past decade or so. And while you can see that imports, which are denoted in the blue line, are very low relative to domestic production, which is the red line, because of the lack of infrastructure in Costa Rica and the lack of information gathering and the lack of record keeping, any imports create enough. Small producers really can't decide how to negotiate their prices. So they're also facing a significant amount of pressure from trade. So returning to the research questions, I think that the SENASA law and the biogas program, which are both environmental policies and initiatives, are contributing to the trend in Costa Rica toward concentrated intensified pig production. And I think that whether or not this has an overall greater negative environmental impact would require a much more quantitative type of study that I hope to pursue at some point. You'd have to really look at the balance between two things. One is the decrease in environmental impact that the policy achieves. So, the biogas program is definitely mitigating climate change. However, is it also incentivizing production so much that the greater number of animals and the transition to using concentrate feed balances that? And that's the type of calculation that's not being done, and maybe should be done environmental impact study. So broader policy implications, basically we want environmental policies to reduce overall environmental impact, not just environmental impact per unit of production. There's support for these types of policies in a range of literature, from livestock scientists to political geographers. And in general, just a reminder that climate change mitigation policies should actually reduce emissions overall, and probably also watch out for a more complete range of environmental objectives like the nutrient cycle and soil organic matter. And we really need to understand how these incentives are affecting the people who directly manage the land, such as producers. So finally, these are some pig producers I met in Costa Rica. We just want to make sure that the producers who are competing successfully are the ones who are treating the environment well. These are references which I'm happy to share with anyone who's interested. And thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Leah, for showing us this here today. I think we can go now into the question and answer round, but as kind of moderator, I take the privilege to go first and sneak in my question first. I have a number of questions, so it's a kind of difficult choice where to begin, but maybe I first thank you for presenting this
Thank
research.
you for having me.
It's really an area that I didn't know so much about. And of course, one of the questions is, if I understood you correctly, one of the messages from your research is that the more industrialized livestock production, concentrate feed, is better under climate change objectives than grass-fed livestock. And that's, of course, first of all, coming, being naive, coming to, from maybe a more ecologically minded person, thinking that the grass-fed option is the better option because it's closer to nature. So that's, of course, something that stuns me first. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, that's a question. And it was reading some research that some colleagues were doing, showing that point that first got me interested in this, because I thought that can't be right. But it is a bit of a complicated story, and it is true that, as with any metric, the calculation depends on what you include. And you know, if we think back to the pie chart, because of the nature of the animal and the nature of the feed, the large-scale industrialized production systems tend to have a much lower emissions intensity than pasture per unit of output or per animal. Greenhouse gas emissions are lower, but that tends to be the case only if you leave out the emissions associated with the feed production itself. So that's really the key. And a lot of the research that's coming out on emissions from livestock is limited to on-farm activity, because it's really difficult to source the feed and to figure out how much how much emissions are associated with it. The emissions would be nitrous oxide and N2O, which is from the synthetic nitrogen fertilizer that you use in producing basically the crop monocultures they use. So, I mean, that's a great question that I'm trying to ask, is like, why are we using this metric when we're measuring gases and not a more holistic metric? I think there are people who are doing it. It's just not as popular as on-farm emission calculations.
Yeah, it makes it more complex. I could ask follow-up questions now, but I also want to open the floor to everybody else here in the room. And I don't know if we even have questions coming from outside. I don't know, Andrew will let us know when we get some.
Okay.
But you can also ask questions yourself.
Okay.
So, and it can be questions, but also comments, maybe from your own research or experience. Anybody here in the room?
Sure, I have a question.
Yeah.
So so I work on ELEAP, and our core focus is sharing best practices between Europe and the United States and North America. And I was wondering if you had any sense of how this sort of problem is being studied and addressed in Europe, and if there are solutions in Europe that maybe aren't really being examined in the United States or in North America that could be employed.
Yeah, that's a great question. I honestly don't know very much about Europe. And I honestly don't even know that much about the United States yet, because most of the biodigesters that I've seen are in Latin America, meaning that they're small scale, and the large scale ones I've seen by US standards are still small scale. It's a completely different landscape. So I think most of the farmers that we're dealing with in Latin America are using biodigesters more as a source of energy, either for household or for actual use on farm to power generators for whatever else they're doing. And in the U.S., though, they're just massive, and they could probably be even large enough to feed back into the grid. I'm sort of just starting to get into that now. And I think Europe is in sort of that middle ground where they're not using anaerobic digestion to power rural households, and they have large scale intensified agriculture, but not to the same extent as the US. So I guess I'm kind of in a similar position as you are, where I'm just starting to look outside of Latin America to see what else is being done.
Thank you. I mean, that's also an interesting point about the impact that the two legislative acts, but also the whole approach to understanding farm side or livestock emissions has on trends in farm size or farm economics development. So the question is, you showed the decline in the number of farms and the rise in the number of animals or pigs in that context. So do you think that this is inevitably pushing for larger and larger farm sizes or large-scale farming? And if so, then what are the social implications for these emerging economies in Latin America? Do you have any information on that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I don't know that I really know enough to say what's happening in Latin America. I know this case very well, and I think that livestock production globally is trending toward large-scale industrial no matter what. I don't think environmental policies are causing it. Mm-hmm.
So you would say it's like going together, but it's not a direct causal relationship. There are many other factors.
There there are many other factors, where governments put subsidies, and trade is also key, especially in Latin America. But I do think that if you're from the environmental field and you're trying to design an incentive, it's worth thinking about, does it contribute towards this trend, because that trend does have profound environmental impacts.
Right.
I think that would be a great subject of some good future research.
Yeah. So you have already a few new research projects lined up there. So that's good. It's good to not end a research project with final answers, but have more questions. And one question that I also took from the presentation, from one of the slides very early on, where you showed the global contribution of farming to global anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, and the range was quite astounding. It was from something around 15% to something, I think, even above 50%.
Yeah.
So it's, of course, quite a different number there. And you could say 15% matters too. Yeah, it's not that it doesn't matter, but 50% is definitely a different number.
Yeah.
How's
Sure.
that?
Well, yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, because it allows me to push a couple of authors who I hope everyone will read. The 51% is from a World Watch article that was published in 2009 by 2 World Bank environmental specialists. I'm happy to pass on the reference. And it's very, it got a lot of press. It was written about in the scientific community and also in the New York Times, and because it threw this fundamental FAO report from 2006, which is the much lower calculation, into doubt. Also, maybe in a bit of a harsh way. Maybe that's why I got so much press. But basically, the initial estimations don't include a couple of really important things. They don't necessarily include deforestation, emissions associated with deforestation. They also don't include, they don't include fish. That's also controversial. A lot of people see farmed fish as an important part of livestock production because it's farmed protein. They also don't include animal respiration. And I've somehow managed to avoid saying this until now, but almost 40% of the emissions associated with livestock is from flatulence and belching. On top of it, there's just normal respiration, which in ruminants actually contributes even more. So the picture is a bit complicated, but again, it depends on what you include in your calculations. And the 51% is from a couple of people who really looked at the entire life cycle. And it's a very interesting article because it also calls on consumers to make decisions about where they purchase the meat and the livestock products that they consume. When we're talking about emissions intensity versus absolute emissions, I think that's really the key question.
One also, you presented these 2 legal acts, these subsidy programs in 2 countries. Do you have any information about how, basically the history of these laws, how they came about, who was basically lobbying for them, and whether there was a debate about them in these countries?
Sure. That's a really good question. I probably should have talked about that. The SENASA law that requires manure management, my theory is that it's related to free trade because of the timing of the law and because of some quotes I have from some ministry officials, but it's hard to verify that kind of thing.
Right.
But when you open up to free trade and you want to export products, you have to start implementing all kinds of regulations to make sure that those products fulfill whatever agreement you've signed. And one of them is environmental. And I do think that that law was related to the implementation of CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, which finally started being implemented in Costa Rica in 2009, but they signed it earlier. So that's why free trade is an important part of the story also. And the second program, I would tie to the international movement to make carbon neutrality commitments, which Costa Rica did for 2020. They're aiming to be carbon neutral by 2020. So there's also a domestic push to commit to alternative energy. and it's into the public electricity utility that I mentioned, really pushing technologies that reduce emissions, including on farm. So I think, yeah, they both tie well into some broader global movements, for example, trade liberalization and international encouragement to make carbon neutrality commitments.
Another question.
So, yeah, Max
Yeah.
asked a lot of the questions I had in mind. He's really using his prerogative as moderator. So you mentioned that because of these two policies, larger industrial farms really have the advantage. How is that sort of playing out for the smaller farmers? Are they literally losing jobs, being pushed out of the market and being forced to shift other crops? Or are they finding ways of being more innovative? Is there a system in place that supports, is there some alternative system in place that allows the smaller farmers to be more competitive in another way, perhaps?
That's a really great question. I also like how you said that the large farms are gaining the advantage, because that's a very accurate and somehow also apolitical way of saying it. And I think I'm going to use that just so you know. But I think that if this were happening in the US, for example, there would be programs to pick up the small farmer. There would be free extension. There might be a subsidy to help farmers pay for the infrastructure that they're being required to purchase and install. But because we're talking about Latin America, I think in this case, that's just outside of the capacity of the government. So it is scale neutral, meaning that it affects everybody equally. And that means that after 6 months of time in which farmers can comply, they're shut down. And enforcement is very strong. And I've talked to a few people who used to be producers who aren't anymore because of that. And essentially they politely harass you for about 6 months, and then they involve the court system, and you have to shut down production and figure out what else to do. And it's very traumatic for people. So it would be great to have some kind of funds, to ease that kind of transition for small farmers, so they can figure out how to finance regulation compliance.
So another thing you said that I might have interpreted this incorrectly, but one of the reasons the larger farms get an advantage is because the power provider, the electric utility, is only interested in really sort of co-investing in biogas technology at a certain scale. Why is
I had to figure that out for myself too. Basically, it's just it's only profitable from their perspective to fund large scale biodigesters because of the length of time that the materials hold out, and basically because ICE is ICE, so they say ICE is trying to increase the proportion of energy that Costa Rica uses that is renewable or clean or alternative. And so they basically want to impact at scale. And it's much cheaper for them to build 3 massive biodigesters than it is for them to go around building lots of small biodigesters that are only going to be used for a kitchen stove, because of the investment in materials and how long they tend to hold out.
So as part of the reason why small farms are suffering or not being able to take full advantage of that opportunity, is it partially due because of the lack of connectivity to a grid or a way of really
right? That's also a really good question. Yeah, I mean, essentially it's just cost prohibitive to implement the type of tubing everywhere you need to connect lots of small biodigesters to some kind of central grid.
Is there any way that you could look at the small farms and see them having a particular advantage that maybe the larger ones don't, that could make them more competitive?
I mean, that would be great. And the funny thing is, I mean, it's not funny. The thing is that even before you start looking at environmental policy, I think in many countries, probably I don't know them as well, small farmers are already just barely making it. And I think that in this case, it's the same, that for 2 decades after the onset of a couple of trade agreements that have hit small farmers hard because of the influx of imports, when you add this SENASA law, and then when you increase competitiveness of the large emitters with the biogas. It's just that little increase in pressure that forces a lot of them to come up, dealing with all kinds of problems basically. And I think in this case anyway, is if you're going to introduce an environmental policy, also maybe take a look at the broader policy context. What else is impacting producers? What else is impacting the way people think about their production system? Is it something going on in agriculture? Is it something going on in trade? How is your policy going to interact with other policies? And is that going to affect the outcome that you want? In this case, it doesn't look too good for the small producers.
Can I ask, does the market price for the average citizen in Costa Rica stay the same because there's subsidies to create the biogas, or does that go up because it's more expensive to produce?
The market price for
so if you want to be on the grid, if you want to have electricity going to your office, your home, is that the same as it would be to bring it to a village, or does that change depending on what kind of grid you're working in?
So how much you're paying for it? It shouldn't be too different because they ESA is like over 95% of the provider, or provides over 95% of the electricity in the country. So I don't think that would be too different. But basically, if you have a biodigester, and if you can have a biodigester with like 5 pigs, and if you're just a small household, you don't need to be connected to anything, and it's essentially free as long as you keep the maintenance up.
And just to kind of off of his question about the biogas and why it's better or why they're targeting the larger farms, it's usually because what goes in the anaerobic digester kind of contributes to the amount of biogas and the consistency that will come out. So if you have this industrial farm that is feeding it with the feedstock, like you said, that's imported, and you know exactly what it is, and it's not scraps from that. It's like, as an investment, it's more consistent. Yeah. And you're going to have you're going to know the actual percentage of biogas that's coming out of the anaerobic digester. So it just ends up being a better investment from a business standpoint to go into like a large farm, because it's going to produce more biogas that's more consistent.
Mm-hmm. So you think that
also feeds the problem though of having people import the feedstock that is more consistent and things along those lines. That's usually why.
So you think ESA is probably checking what feed is going into the production system that's then going into the biodigester?
That's how it's done here, definitely. And
interesting.
That's a science of what goes in manure-wise, so what goes into the cows, and then kind of what will come out of it.
Okay, that's interesting.
So I know that's here that investors definitely look a big time on that.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's interesting what you said about just using waste to feed the animals as opposed to concentrate, because another funny thing is that like taste for meat plays a role in this. Mm-hmm. Costa Ricans really like fatty meat, and they think that feeding animals with whatever is left over from their kitchen produces the best tasting meat. The market in the US is completely different because they like leaner meats, so they want only concentrate fed meat. So as the market shifts towards exporting pig products with CAFTA, there's an impetus to switch to grain fed, which also impacts emissions, and it's because of this, just sort of how it tastes. And the Costa Ricans, when you talk to them, they're saying, we don't get it. The meat we eat, we produce using table scraps, and we like that. We would never eat this, corn-fed stuff.
So it's very interesting. It's where cultural aspects come in again.
Yeah.
Where you come then back again to social issues, because cultural is closer than to social aspects. It's very interesting. It's also a question whether tastes globally converge, whether there's going to be more global food culture as well. And then again, you see that in industrialized countries, maybe yet at a very small scale, but some roll back towards old pig breeds.
Oh, okay.
And new, rediscovering the old basically, and moving away from the lean meat towards the more, well, I wouldn't say, if I say natural way, that's already judging it in a way. I'm not trying to, I'm just saying it's going back, stepping away from traditional, artisanal. Mm-hmm. But of course, that's a niche market and probably will be for quite a while just because of cost considerations again. So we have all these trade-offs. And that's very interesting to see that. So it's not the one silver bullet here, really. Also looking at the three directions, and there are probably a lot more. You have the social aspect and the economic aspects related to trade, very important also for these economies. And then you have general environmental impacts and the specific climate impacts. And that's one thing I wanted to bring back, because we say emerging leaders in environmental and energy, climate and general considerations. Are these at odds here, looking at the case of the pig farming, or is it just a matter of system boundaries, what we look at? Are these not at odds and just as a matter of having a full-scale integrated assessment? What's your take on this?
I don't think they're at odds, but I think that the nature of the climate change debate, which is very time sensitive, it's got to be 2 degrees by a certain amount of time, very rightfully so, is imbued with the sense of urgency that tends to focus the conversation on emissions per activity or unit of something produced. And I totally I understand that. And but maybe this is just a reminder to maintain that broader perspective when you design incentives to reduce emissions. Look at what it's doing for soil conservation, what it's doing for biodiversity, what it's doing for small farmers who will continue diversified agriculture.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
I kind of an odd question that I'd be really impressed if you had a good answer for it. Do you have an idea of if there's a specific type of meat that has a certain taste that happens, you think of the full life cycle to produce it is overall greener, and what would that taste be? Is that more close to the kind of taste things that are fed table scraps, or is it on the other end of the spectrum, or is it somewhere in between?
Well, I'll preface this by saying that I actually don't eat meat and was brought up vegetarian, so find myself in these odd types of situations sometimes where people start asking me about meat and I have to kind of feign some sort of expertise in how it tastes. But I think I can start answering your question without knowing what it actually tastes like. I did taste some also when I was done. It was delicious. But essentially, in the beginning of agriculture, 10,000 years ago, I don't know, whenever they introduced animals, and it was a sort of risk assessment, or sort of a risk strategy. You have the cow, because the cow, it produces milk daily, so it's a reliable daily source of protein. The pig is completely different, because the pig you have to invest in over time. It takes about 4 or 5 months, maybe even up to 6 months to raise a pig to slaughter time. And then you slaughter it, and then you have to either give it away because you won't be able to save it unless you have a refrigerator because you're more modern or something, or you have to dry it or something like that. But there are different ways of having protein available. And that also is a way to recycle waste. So the pig is nice also because you can feed it anything. Pigs will literally almost eat anything, and cows just eat grass. That's very simple. And so if I'm trying to look very holistically at the production of pig meat, then I'm thinking the most sustainable taste is whatever allows you to recycle waste. You don't have to deforest anything to produce pig feed. You just give it whatever you don't eat. And then probably also the emissions associated with the actual production system, whether it's probably how you manage the manure. If you're a diversified farmer, then you take the pig manure and you put it in your coffee production. And you don't have to buy synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. You also contribute to soil organic matter. So I'm looking at basically small scale production of very fatty pig meat as being the answer to your question.
Tasting the healthiest for the environment.
Yeah, it's a great way to ask the question though.
Nice conclusion also. So
Who's hungry?
Are there any more questions in the room or comments before we then wrap it up? I think it's, again, I was extremely impressed by the depth of the information, by the expertise you've gathered in your studies and spending time on site. So it's very impressive. It shows you again that you can do a lot from a desk, from afar, but nothing can replace going local and being in touch and talking to actually the farmers. I think you mentioned that it was a lot of effort. You said lengthy interviews, but I think it really gives you a very different perspective from just having statistical data. I think that's also the richness of it, combining statistical information, which is of course very neutral and non-personalized, and then the individual voices of the farmers. So thank you very much for being here today with us. And I hope we'll be in touch, and I hope we'll have more ELEAP lunch events very soon upcoming. We don't have a next date yet, but we'll work this out, Dan and I will talk about it. And so everybody, please stay in touch with us. You can, of course, connect to us via the ecologic accounts, but also there's an ELEAP website and an ELEAP Twitter feed. And so please feel free to get in touch with us. And I want to also point out that currently we have the open recruitment period for the next generation of ELEAP fellows, which is open until the 19th of July. So you still have time to send in an application in case you feel interested. So a little bit of advertisement on the side here for us, but I hope you don't mind.
Of course not.
Okay. Well, if you want to say any final words to the round.
Just thank you to Max for inviting me, and also to the very industrious interns here who have set up this really nice lunch and webcast. And thank you to everybody who's come for your really great questions. I'm definitely going to think about them as I move forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you.